First of all, I would like to welcome Dr. Heidemarie Winkel, who's actually a very good friend of this place and of a good friend of mine, who will speak this morning on gender, nation, and culture in Palestine, approaching the decolonization of social categories and realities. Dr. Heidemarie is a professor of sociology at Bielefeld University in Germany and senior research associate at the University of Cambridge, St. Edmund's College. Her research centers on transcultural gender studies and a globally oriented sociology of religion with a specific interest in the Mashriq Orient. Theoretically, the focus is on religious orders of knowledge and religion as social anchor of political sense-making, including an interest in the shifting of cultural knowledge patterns, such as gender codes and notions of gender justice. A recent publication is Global Contestation of Gender Rights. It's on open access. Together with Sheely and Roth. And it would be good to share perhaps the link at one point for all participants to be able to read. Thank you very much and welcome, Dr. Heidemarie.
Thank you so much, Rana. Before I start, I have to say two things. First, I want to express my sincerest gratitude for the possibility to come here. Thank you so much for the hospitality of all of you and what you've prepared for us. And thank you to all of you. You are such a wonderful, I would say we are such a wonderful group. And I will take so many important ideas and talks, etc., home with me. Thank you for that. And the second point I have to make is that against the backdrop of all that we heard during the last days, I have to talk about my positionality as a white woman. I consider myself as a woman, but please don't take this for granted. As a white woman from Europe, that means, I also have to be aware, of course, of the residue of colonialism. And I still also think about this point. I think it was either Otis Moss or Ramina Shashibi who said that his and everybody's freedom is connected to your freedom. So also my freedom, of course, is connected to the freedom of everybody here, also to Palestinians. And I say this particularly as a German, so you know what this means. Okay, now I start. So, my written contribution addresses the nexus between gender, nation, and culture. And I just want to mention that before I really start, namely as a framework of orientation, which is very important for me as a sociologist, a framework of orientation for self-understanding and political action. I want to remind us why it's really urgent for us to keep reinterpreting gender relations in the constellation of an institutionally weak Palestinian Authority as well as apartheid, as defined, for example, in the Rome Statute of the International Court. In this presentation now today, I look at a single facet, namely, it's not working now because I made it wrong. So that's working now. So I look at a single facet, namely how the constellation of colonial power imbalance has shaped the struggles for gender justice. I assume that gender and sexuality are mobilized through the occupation as much as in the liberation struggle in the 70s and 80s, during the institutionalization of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, in the 1990s, or in times of increasing, restabilizing political authoritarianism. In each of these constellations, women's bodies are an object of power struggles. And this concerns areas such as, of course, fertility, sexuality, but also divorce or child custody. And the symbolic medium within which this takes place is called culture. A gender theoretical lens is vital as women, or rather everyone who struggles with social expectations of gender normativity is affected by multiple power dynamics. This also concerns men, of course, and the patterns of male dominance. For example, Palestinian nationalism's reliance on heightened masculinity, as Said Atzan points out in his really fantastic publication on queer Palestinians. I think it's on, yes, I put it, sorry, it's just right behind my back. So I really recommend this publication on queer Palestinians. That is, hegemonic masculinity is constantly challenged as a result of political powerlessness and colonial dominance. And this indicates that nationalism and national politics are not gender neutral. Any postponement of addressing gender justice thus deepens injustice. To put it another way, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, as Audre Lorde has emphasized. Audre Lorde, who defined herself as a black feminist, lesbian, writer, poet, and allow me please to quote her. And she also emphasized that there is also no hierarchy of oppressions according to which political liberation can be isolated from other forms of oppression. Oppression understood as, let's say, a lack of political power, access to legal or any other social resources, is always a gendered state of being in which the ethnopolitical dimension of the self intersects with its gendered dimension. Looking at the nexus between gender, nation, and culture hence indicates the direction in which the fragmented Palestinian society as a whole is moving. The constant victimization by both the colonial settler regime, and here I follow Nancy Shoemaker, 2015. So both the colonial settler regime and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, as well as the lack of sovereignty, bring about a negative legal tradition with serious consequences for gender justice. A central case is the stagnation in legislation on family life. I will deepen this at the end, and just let me say that the criticism was so fierce that the draft of the expected Family Protection Act, which was submitted for ratification in 2020, was rejected. I think that's a slap in the face of justice, really. So, this development, and this is also very important, is accompanied by an alarming increase of gender-based violence. But as women, Palestinian women, are of course aware of everything and are powerful, they also are protesting against it. The pictures here behind me show some of the protests from 2019 of a group, Talat, and it was great to see also that this was a trans-local, a trans-regional, trans-national protest in Beirut, and also I'm proud to say that in Berlin, women protested against this whole situation, protested for liberation and gender justice. So, the consolidation of anti-gender politics is, however, not unique to Palestine. We are witnessing a worldwide contestation of gender rights in increasingly authoritarian political environments in which anti-gender politics form an important component. And I was grateful to have this research group where we had colleagues from Pakistan to Morocco till up to Brazil, Colombia, also colleagues from the US and several European countries, and also one Palestinian colleague was part of this group. So we shared this interest in the global contestations of gender rights. Seen in this light, Palestine is one case among many, albeit under its own conditions of a political struggle. Against this backdrop, I consider it central to ask how women's rights and status, which were once a touchstone for liberation struggles and decolonial nationalisms worldwide, have increasingly become contested in Palestine. In the written contribution, I review selected turning points of the struggle from the 1920s to the present. Today, I focus on the colonial legacy of the gender contract in Palestine, or better to say, the gender contract and Palestinian nationalism. I briefly recall the colonial implications of selected knowledge scripts, and finally I address the current contestations of rights. So I come to my first point. I always have to turn around a bit to see where I'm. Okay, that's okay, I'm fine. So, immediately in the decades of rising Palestinian nationalism in the 1920s and 30s, a colonial legacy was woven into the gender contract that underlies the social contract. I can just name a few facets, which are also here on the slide. The most fundamental one is the cultural symbolization of women in the national imaginary, for example, as cultural bearers or as custodians of national heritage. It's important because this is also a typical feature of European nationalisms as well, and is in many ways clearly directed against, from a European perspective, directed against the colonial other. Consequently, any turn to so-called cultural origins or search for cultural authenticity framed in gendered terminology actually follows a colonial regime of thought. That is, the symbolization of womanhood as a cultural core of white colonial ideology, according to which non-white, non-Western bodies are racialized and denied the normativities addressed to white people. And then it's interesting to think about the question what whiteness means in this context. I simply take it first and foremost as a category of power, whiteness as a category of power, so and what means whiteness then in diverse context. So anyway, this indicates that gender and culture function as colonial knowledge categories, as colonial knowledge codes, with the consequence that women disappear in the national imaginary as political actors. While women are marked as different in the national framework, masculinity is privileged. Whether in the National Charter from 1964, the communiques of the United National Liberation Union, which was the organizing body of the First Intifada, or in the Declaration of Independence from 1988, the Palestinian nation, I quote now Noor Masala, the Palestinian nation is imagined as a male body, while the struggle against occupation functions as an affirmation of Palestinian nationalist agency. Joseph Mossad says that this evolves into a masculinizing act, enabling the concrete pairing of nationalist agency and masculinity and the logical inseparability. And this is a central element in the social fabric of patriarchal nationalism. The patriarchal gender contract is additionally supported by communal and kinship relations. And under the PA, these structures have even been solidified. This is discussed and described by many Palestinian gender researchers here in the region. Isla Jad, for example, describes the constellation as a neo-patriarchal system of rule that results from the renewal of the Hamula, the extended family, as a state mechanism. So imagine this, the extended family as a state mechanism to consolidate political allegiance in the context of the PA. Problematic is also the separation of kinship relations from legal intervention. It serves above all masculine dominance. In a legal contribution, Mohammed, Hattab, and Berthe from 2023, I highly recommend this paper, explain why it's so controversial to legislate restrictions to the domestic sphere. It's experienced, as they describe, it's experienced as frightening to the population, and the domestic realm is considered the sacred right of the family and the constellation of comprehensive economical, political, military, and legal oppression and insecurity. This indicates a twofold colonial legacy, I would say. In addition to the colonial occupation, in which the right to political self-determination and human rights are continuously violated, Palestinian women additionally cannot assert their rights as equal citizens if the family, as the male-dominated space par excellence, is shielded from the enforcement of legal equality. I come to the point of colonial knowledge scripts. Yes, so that's the right slide. The colonial constellation contributes tremendously to the culturalization of gender and family and women's subalternization within the framework of male-dominated nationalism. Regarding the colonial constellation, I differentiate between endogenous and exogenous factors, including the social history of ideas, culture, and memory, of course. As far as exogenous factors are concerned, I think not only of Britain and the US, which were permanently mentioned during the conference, but also, of course, I think of Germany, not because German Orientalists helped prepare the intellectual infrastructure, but Germany is one of the largest donors now here today in our political reality, but does not apply the mechanisms of international law when it comes to Palestine. For the understanding of colonialism, power over land is, of course, crucial. Material aspects were discussed in varying ways perfectly well during the whole conference. But it's equally important to consider central narratives, ideas, and scripts of social life. In Culture and Imperialism, Edward Said writes that narrative is crucial because stories are at the heart of what explorers and novelists say about strange regions of the world. And I would add how people experience the world. Currently, as Said Atzan argues, I'm referring now again to his book, Queer Palestinians, he argues that ethno-religious Zionism is making enormous efforts to recognize, this is a quote, to recognize Israel as an indigenous nation to fully enfranchise only one ethno-religious group, as codified in the nation-state law from 2018. This also includes, and this is my point here, this also includes a re-masculinization of both Jewish and Palestinian national identity and institutional authoritarianism in the PA and at the level of local authorities is part of this constellation, as I would argue. The prevalence of authoritarian political structures and mindsets prompted one of my interviews. I had some talks during the last 3 weeks. It prompted one of my interviews to say, there is no social contract anymore in Palestine. And this is really something to think about. So what does this mean from a gender perspective? As Edward Said points out, culture is not only a refining or elevating means, and it was addressed in this conference so often, of course, as a refining and elevating means. Said says wrote in times, culture comes to be associated often aggressively with a nation or the antagonistic differentiation between us and them. And this is a colonial knowledge code which is described in Latin American post-colonial theories as coloniality of difference. And this coloniality of difference also structures social reality and experience in Palestine, not only in relation to settler colonialism, colonial reality, but also, I would say, when we think of gender in this context. So, but as the focus is mainly on national narratives and sovereignty over the land, the gender perspective is once again pushed into the background in the political discussions, although gender is used very explicitly as a combative resource of collective identity. For example, when women are addressed as signifier of national honor. For example, yes, and the coloniality of difference, however, leaves a strong trace in women's existence, legitimated by so-called returns to cultural traditions, which often center on rigorous codes of intellectual and moral behavior, as Said underlines, while pluralism and ambiguity are rejected. And this is a typical feature of authoritarianism and fundamentalist ways of thinking. Coming to my last point, my last chapter. I said there are exogenous but also endogenous factors that contribute to the way how gender functions as a combative resource of collective identity and how gender rights have become an object of constant tensions. Already during the hoped-for transition period in the 1990s, the male-dominated gender contract was reinvented under the regime of the PA, partly referred to as neo-patriarchal nationalism, and it was consolidated over the past 2 decades. In her wonderful studies on legacies of authoritarianism, Rana Khoury, you see her, you see the cover in the back. She shows how the critical role of civil society was neutralized and how social movements, including the women's organizations, were demobilized as a consequence, A, of the effects of the material and intellectual colonial constellation, and as a consequence, B, of the way how the PA is institutionalized, how it operates, for example, through presidential decrees. Who needs a parliament? And as a result of its increasingly oppressive politics, al-Kalima shows not only how the state-building project was used to build patronage networks and neutralize potential opposition, but also how these complex developments were influenced and fostered by international actors. So this is the double dose of colonialism. So what remains unobserved in this view is how the political institutions, the PLO, for example, the parties and the legal constitution contribute to male privilege, and that the key documents and rights have been denied, simply denied. It was a slap in the face, I said this already, that the Declaration of Principles on Palestinian Women's Rights was not adopted. I come to the end. And also then that the family protection law was rejected. So I think it's this combination of patriarchal authoritarianism and religious fundamentalism that forced its way. And now I conclude, Rana, with 2 sentences. Even though Palestine is under colonial occupation and apartheid is fierce, this is not a sufficient reason, in my perspective, for women to be deprived of basic rights. This is not to disregard that the occupation itself is a structural form of gendered violence and oppression. However, gender and sexuality are not only mobilized by occupation, but also by neo-patriarchal nationalism, which rests on male privilege, and this is homemade. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Heidemarie.